Good evening. I'd like to call the Committee of the Whole for the Village of Cary for Tuesday, August 20th, 2019 to order with roll call, please.
Betts? Here. Weinhammer? Here. Collier?
Here.
Cavelli? Here. McAlpine? Here. Kraus?
Here.
Thank you. It's 6:27. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll now move to the public comment. Is there anybody who would like to address the Committee of the Whole? We had nobody sign in, but happy to hear from you. We'll go ahead and close public comment at 6:28. Moving forward, discussion regarding this Cary Senior Living Community Room Use Agreement.
Do you want
Brian?
to report on that?
Pardon?
Did you want to report from him?
Does anybody have any other questions or anything?
We, just so the board is aware,
What I wanted to see, so.
yeah, we had followed up with the village board related to some minutes. I think that was asked for, some links to previous videos where these items were discussed. Within your packet is the information that we discussed at the previous meeting. As we talked about at last meeting, there will be that provision included in there that it's a 15-year agreement with 1-year continuations, automatic renewals, I should say, that have to, if there's any change, have to be agreed to by both parties. So tonight, we just wanted to continue our discussion from last meeting, get any feedback from the village board. We do have representatives from the development team here too, if there's any specific questions for them and the use of the community room.
Can you just explain the 15-year thing again to me, why it's 15 years, why that hard number exists?
So the low-income housing tax credit program that the project received funding through, the initial term of those loans or the financing is a 15-year term to be able to provide rents or units for lower than market rate. So that's how their tax financing goes for the project. So that initial 15-year term aligns with that provision of the financing for the project. The intent is to continue the use of the room beyond that time period, but that 15-year term is the initial restriction or allowance under the Act for these types of projects.
So do they have to apply yearly to be able to provide that lower rate?
No.
Or is it they
No,
apply
it's-
after 15 years and they get another 15 years?
Correct. It's a 15-year term with a 15-year renewal period. So the intent of this agreement is to provide that use of that space for a longer time period, and then so that it wouldn't be kind of continued in perpetuity. If the property ownership changes there's the ability to modify the agreement from that perspective. That's where the 1-year renewals come in. But the 15-year time period is to co-align with that basically the financing for the project.
So after 15 years, if they don't receive the financing again and it changes ownership, then would our agreement then no longer be valid?
There would be modifications to the agreement would require approval by this board. So depending on how the use of that structure would continue, is approved as a senior housing project, so that if the financing limitations were to go away and were used for another purpose, it would still need to comply with our zoning. And then also the use of the space would need approval to modify this agreement so that essentially the agreement before you doesn't have an end date to it. With that 1-year continuous renewals, it would need to come back to the board for consideration to terminate or modify it from there.
So if another company were to buy this property in 15 years, there's no guarantee, even if we have a MOU in place that says year after year, that would be the case?
No. So if another developer purchased that property, this would transfer to that property owner as well. It would be a contingent upon the property, so it would continue on with the property going forward. And then any changes to it would come back before the board for consideration to modify or terminate that agreement.
It's an automatic renewal.
Right.
Okay, regardless of who the owner is.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's part of the conditional use.
Right. There's a requirement of the conditional use for the property, so then there needs to be an agreement for the use of that space.
So then, in other words, this MOU can carry on indefinitely?
Yes.
Unless it's changed
Unless
by
it's
the board, because it's a conditional use. So
Right.
Both parties,
any changes has to come through a board.
both parties have to agree to change.
Okay. And then as far as the other concern that I brought up is I'd like to see that seniors in our community, that they don't have to pay for any sort of janitorial, trash removal, insurance costs to utilize the room. So let's say you had a group of seniors that wanted to use the room to have a get-together and play cards, that they would have the luxury of doing that without having to pay those fees. Is that something we've discussed with the company that's possible?
It's conversations I've had with the developer regarding the space. It's their belief that the room was never intended to be utilized for that, in those purposes. It was intended for local government agencies or organizations to utilize it for programming, but that it wouldn't be open as an open community room, specifically for any resident to come in and utilize. Would specifically be utilized for programming for seniors, either in the development or potentially in the community. The way the agreement's drafted, it would be free of charge for the village, park district, township, or other taxing body to utilize it for programming. If the library wanted to host an event there to do an event with seniors, they can do something from that perspective. Other not-for-profits could also utilize the room if they're utilizing for programming for seniors. So if a church wanted to use it, or a Cub Scout group wanted to host an event there for seniors to do something, I could see that as something that would be eligible as well. But a resident, Joe Smith or whatever, a resident of the Village Cary, wouldn't be able to utilize it for hosting a birthday party if they don't live in that facility.
But the non-for-profit groups, that's at a cost. There's a cost.
Unless it's
Nominal
senior
cost,
oriented.
Yeah, nominal cost. So it more, the way the agreement's drafted would be, specifically for, like, say, an hourly charge for, if you're reserving the room for 2 hours, it might be $20 to cover the cost for managing the, trash and things like that for the facility. This agreement's similar to one I've done in another community for a different type of facility, but it was a private, publicly owned facility that was managed by a management company that we provided various services to the community, and certain types of events were free of charge. Other ones did have nominal fees for the use of that space.
So just so I'm clear, so you brought up like the Boy Scouts, if they were to do some programming for seniors, they would pay these nominal fees even though they're a non-for-profit, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then my other question was, I just wanted clarification on what constitutes, it says local government entities. How far-reaching is local government entities? Is that specific to Cary? Is it?
If a local government agency wanted to utilize it, so the Village of Cary Park District, I mentioned the township office.
What about if someone from Barrington, a local government entity from Barrington or Fox River Grove or Crystal Lake, are those included in that? What's considered local?
Based on the definition, I think they would be included. If they're a government agency, they'd be allowed to utilize the space. The intent is for local, to the community from a Cary perspective that serve this area. But if it was another, agency that providing a service that serves the residents of the Village of Cary, they could potentially utilize that room as well.
Anything else, Kim?
I've
So
said
just
everything I can say.
recapping what you had said, Brian, there is a fee to be utilized for garbage disposal and things like that for renting room, even for non-for-profits.
Correct.
Okay, so everybody would be charged a fee to use it, except for local government agencies, but not-for-profits would be charged?
Yes. So for a not-for-profit agency, if they were to utilize a space, if they're providing, they can utilize the space for programming for seniors if they're hosting, some event in there. But there would be basically a nominal charge to pay for the management of that room, the cleanup of the space after they're utilized.
What is the goal for this room? Is it will seniors have events there through their building where they can kind of get together and get to meet their neighbors, or is there another room like that they get to utilize? Or I haven't been in the building, I haven't seen it, so I don't know.
Sure. I mean, there's several rooms that they have within the facility. This is a larger space. It's in the center of the building near the entrance. It's will be access controlled, so individuals that are entering the building, that live in the building, I should say, have key fob access to the portions of the building that they live in. This room will be kind of outside of that electronic access area, so that individuals could enter the building and wouldn't have access to the rest of the structure. They do have other spaces within the building for residents that they can use. There's a lounge area. On the first level, there are other seating areas that have on each individual level, as well as in addition to fitness rooms, computer labs, and other
Let's say
community
that
space.
there's a manager on duty there, correct?
Correct.
So let's say that she wants to plan like a bingo event for the residents. They can go ahead and use that space free of charge?
Correct. The residents of the building. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's meant, when you talk about what the spirit of it was to enhance the senior programming that we have here. And just, it's like an annex for additional things for our local seniors. And I had the opportunity of touring it this afternoon, and it's quite impressive. The actual room that we'll be able to utilize is quite adequate. It's got a kitchen in it. It's, access to the front, as Brian had mentioned. It's really light and bright, ample parking. It's really, I mean, the individual units are very nice. Very nice. It'll be a great amenity for our seniors in the village.
So the Kraus Senior Center, are those, the events that are there, is that all run through the Park District?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just kind of going back to a couple of years ago in this past being on the board. I remember one of the things we talked about is things like, I think Senator McConkey holds various things on like fraud for seniors or different types of programs that he likes to do. That would be an avenue that could be used there, correct?
Correct.
So, I mean, I think that was the goal, to say, how do we, as our demographic of seniors continues to grow, we want to make sure that we have additional opportunities for different places, venues for them to meet.
Any other questions on this?
I got a question. So who's ever using it, Village of Cary, the Park District, local organizations, it has to be for senior programming only.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Want to be clear.
Is this something that we could put on the next consent agenda, or do you want items for separate action?
I'm planning for consent.
Consent.
Items for separate action?
Well, I'd just like to review it. I mean, probably consent, but I can touch base with Jake.
For the sake of argument, we'll just put it on items for separate action,
That's
just to
fine.
give you an opportunity. Thank you. Moving on to a discussion regarding McRide and PACE transportation programs. I think this is kind of more of an update as to some of the information that you were able to obtain for some of the questions from board members about ridership and that.
Yes, following our last discussion on the matter, the village board had asked for some additional data and information on the ridership from both the PACE Southeast McHenry County Dial-A-Ride service and the current MC Ride program that's just started this year, this January in Fox River Grove, as well as the information of any Cary residents that were currently utilizing the existing MC Ride network in the member towns. So the first item, the PACE Southeast Dial-A-Ride service. PACE did provide us with their 2019 data, so it's from January through June. The average monthly trips, and this is combined for trips to and from Cary. Not all start and end in Cary, some start in Cary and end in other towns. But from an analysis standpoint, trips to and from Cary, average per month is 388 trips.
Sorry to interrupt you, Eric. Do you have something visual or something that we see here?
No,
or-
it'll just be numbers verbally. Some of the data the county was working hard. They're a little short-staffed with some of the matters here, so they were pulling it together as late as today for us.
Okay, can
So
you
we
just
appreciated
repeat
their
that,
efforts.
please?
So PACE Dial-A-Ride, January through June, the average monthly trips to and from Cary were 388 trips per month. Now keep in mind, so of those 388 trips on average per month, 45% roughly of those were to specifically the Pioneer Center for Human Services in McHenry. So 176 of those 388 were specifically just to that one location in McHenry.
We can send this out tomorrow too. I see a lot of people writing feverishly here, so.
Yeah, this all came in late this afternoon. Continue.
Yes, so that was the one question surrounding who was utilizing it from Cary, who's utilizing the PACE service that exists out there from Cary. From the MC Right program in Fox River Grove. So they have just started the program in January, and the county wanted me to stress that a lot of their member communities that start the program, the ridership starts out slow and does typically ramp up year to year. But at least the data from January through June for our neighboring community of Fox River Grove, the average monthly trips to and from Fox River Grove has been 20 per month. And from within that, they have an average of 5 to 7 unique riders per month utilizing it so far. And also keep in mind, Fox River Grove's population is approximately a third or so of Cary's. So do consider scale here.
How many unique riders did you say?
Varied
5 to 7.
5 to 7 per month.
Okay.
What does that mean, unique riders?
Sometimes one rider might make more than 2 or 4 trips per month. In theory, if you had 60 trips, you could have one rider make all 6. But speaking of that, MC Ride for the Cary residents. So they looked at the 2018 calendar year for us. So they looked for the unique riders that listed Cary as their residence and their home address. So in all the year 2018, there were 12 unique riders that made trips in the MC Ride network. Now, keeping in mind that Cary is not a member currently, so they had to start and end their trips outside of Cary and be within one of the communities that's serviced by MC Ride. And those 12 unique riders made 62 trips total in 2018.
Director Morimoto, is there a way to, so those 12 unique riders, Cary address doesn't always mean it's within our corporate boundary. So could those potentially be outside of our corporate boundary?
Those 12 are in the boundary.
They are within our corporate boundary.
Yeah, we can't
Okay.
share the addresses, but we verify with the county they are
Okay,
Cary corporate
thank you.
boundary residents. And then the last question that was raised at the discussion previously was whether or not the Public Transportation Advisory Committee that kind of oversees MC Ride, if they were willing to consider lowering their minimum age for independent ridership. So if someone was desiring to ride for transportation to and from school, the current minimum age is 12. You have to be 12 or older to ride without an adult on that system. And the committee did stress it is public transportation. So with that age threshold, if you are 12 or older, you can ride independently. They did unanimously decline to consider lowering that age, though. They are going to stick to the 12 and above. And those were the 4 areas that we were asked to provide additional data on. As Administrator Reich mentioned, we'll provide a summary of this to you and distribute that to the board. But we just got the data. I wanted to make sure you had it timely so you could add that to your consideration of whether or not the village wishes to pursue an application to the county to enter into the MC Right program.
I know you gave us the data for Fox River Grove and its potential. It's new, so it hasn't reached its full potential yet. What about some of the other neighboring communities that have been utilizing the system longer?
Sure. I've got some of that in front of me.
You do? Okay.
Granted, it's a lot of numbers, so I know without seeing it.
Is there like Crystal Lake, Algonquin, Lincoln Hills, something around there?
Algonquin and Lincoln Hills, I don't think utilize.
They're not members, correct. I have numbers, at least for this year, for Crystal Lake, Fox River Grove, so the current membership, Crystal Lake, Fox River Grove, Harvard, Huntley, Johnsburg, Marengo, McHenry, Richmond, Ringwood, Union, and Woodstock.
Since we
And then
brought
there's
up
some townships as
Crystal
well.
Lake, can we just get those numbers?
Crystal Lake and
I'm
Huntley,
curious.
maybe?
So for comparison, say for January, let's pick 1 month here. In January, Fox River Grove had trips by origin. So trips starting in Fox River Grove. Someone in Fox River Grove called, made a request, and dialed a ride to go somewhere. It may have been out of the town or within the town. There were 2 riders out of Fox River Grove compared to 2,296 out of Crystal Lake, compared to 294 in Huntley in that same month, 146 out of Marengo, 2,201 in McHenry, So it does vary, obviously, the scale of the community and the population base.
Okay.
We can pass that along too, to the
Okay,
board.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Continue to gather more information.
Yep.
Any other questions for Jake or for Eric on that right now?
Just quickly, did we ever supply, and I suppose we probably should ask Missy when she was here, did we ever supply, and maybe Barbara or Martha might know this, did we ever supply the Southeast PACE schedule to the senior center? Because we kind of talked about that, a lot of people may not know that that is available. I don't know, are we able to get a copy of that and supply that to them?
Being a dial-a-ride service, there's no specific schedule. There's obviously just the parameters for the program, links to the website. PACE does their own outreach, but what we can do for sure is put that on our website and then share it with our different partners, like the Park District with the Senior Center, the new senior living apartment complex, other areas that might be interested in it. We can make sure that that information is available.
Yeah, I mean, just if we're,
For all the
and
services.
it's just an idea, maybe we could even throw it in our weekly newsletter at some
Yeah.
point. And that would just kind of, it gets that information out, it gets people thinking about it, I think a lot of people forget that we have some modes of public transportation out there. To me, the more information we can relay out there, we can also see more of a need, because people might say, hey, I didn't realize this was even an option, or hey, can I use this, or this doesn't meet my needs, I need something else. I just would like to get as much information out as possible to various agencies that we think might be able to assist with getting that information out to members.
Yeah. And you'll recall when I believe Mary Donner was here from PACE, she did
Yes.
stress that this is one of the, I think she called it a legacy
Yeah,
program.
exactly.
So it is not one that they widely publicize and they don't commit a lot of resources to.
Right.
I think they only have 1 to 2 buses that run the entire network for all the demand that comes out of that service. Whereas MC Ride, one difference is there is more resources, obviously, given the fact that it does rely in part on grants and in part on the member community contributions. So the efficiency and I think the frequency of the service, there could be a difference in there that I can't speak to, but we'll definitely make sure we get increase our outreach on our website and our usual channels for the currently available services, which includes this PACE program.
Perfect.
I don't think there's a lot of residents that know about the PACE program
Right.
right now.
Right.
I know for a fact, and I work with seniors in Barrington, and we have actually a person from PACE come and talk to our participants. And they give them folders and talk to them about what they need to do, how they need to do it, and with PACE. And I think I could even call Missy and talk to her and let her know what we do in Barrington, and that we have a presentation for the seniors
Right,
for PACE.
great idea.
So we
And
could-
have maybe Mary from PACE, maybe she'd consider, maybe Mary from PACE would consider
That's
then
exactly.
coming out and doing
Mary
something
does
like
come
that.
and she does do a presentation
And that'd be
about
excellent.
PACE and how do they, and then it also goes beyond PACE in Cary. It also talks about how to get, to use the train and the metro system. So.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, we'll continue to gather the information. Next, discussion regarding recreational cannabis. Scott's going to lead us in this.
While we're getting the slides loaded up here, for the board's information, just so you can kind of digest what other communities are talking about, I've sent out some various articles from other communities as they debate this issue. Also today, sent out an FAQ that Kleinthorpe and Jenkins had put together here. We don't need it for the meeting tonight, but it's just more information for the village board to review here as we consider how we want to handle recreational cannabis.
Remember, this is informational. There's no action being taken.
As the village board, village staff is aware, everybody is aware, there is a newly enacted recreational cannabis law in Illinois. Illinois becomes the 11th state in the country to approve recreational use of marijuana for adults. So I want to focus on some of the most significant aspects of this legislation for you to consider, to deliberate on. The village will be responsible for making some important decisions under this legislation. At minimum, depending on what direction you ultimately decide to go, at minimum, the village has to decide whether you're in or out, meaning whether or not you're going to allow retail dispensaries, cultivation centers, infusion centers, infuser, in the village or not. If you elect not to, I'm not presuming you're going to make the decision one way or the other at this point. If you elect not to, you need to take action to prohibit these uses. Dispensaries, cultivation centers will receive licenses. Certain of them will receive authorized licenses from the state. And once they do, they will have the ability to operate unless any municipality in Illinois determines by ordinance to prohibit those uses. So I want to take you through a few of the most important aspects of the legislation at this point. The legislation does not become effective until January 1, 2020. The licenses will not become effective until that time. So as the mayor indicated, you have some time at this point to consider what you want to do, what direction the village proposes to take here. So let's start with some of the issues, some of the information under the act that may be helpful for you in making your decisions. The authorized use is for adults 21 years and over. As you know, if you were paying attention 3 years ago, Illinois enacted a medical cannabis act that separately regulates the medical use of prescription marijuana. I'll touch on that in a few minutes, but for now, that is a separate authorization for cannabis use in Illinois, governed by separate regulations. You will be asked, you, the village, will be asked to make a decision about whether or not you'll allow a dispensary or dispensaries and related cultivation centers in the village. If you choose to allow retail sales in the village, you retain the authority to essentially determine any regulations that would apply by virtue of your zoning code that would apply to the location of a dispensary, the number of potential dispensaries, where those would be located, in what proximity to certain more sensitive uses like schools, parks, churches. You have a great deal of authority and are given the authority under the act to make judgments about where a dispensary would be located and how many there would be. You have more authority here than under the Medical Cannabis Act, which actually dictates that we cannot prohibit dispensaries for medical cannabis. So the Medical Cannabis Act actually contains a good number of proximity controls itself in the act. This act, since it allows you to say yes or no, period, as to whether or not you want dispensaries, if you allow dispensaries, then you determine how you're going to regulate those. You're given a good deal of discretion. The only proximity detail or limitation under the act that is set forth in the act itself is a 1,500-foot distance between dispensing organizations. So there can't be a concentration of these, like some video gaming establishments. These have to be separated by at least a minimum of 1,500 feet. The act also allows, and again, I'm not presuming the village is going to make a decision one way or the other about any of these uses, allows municipalities to authorize cannabis cafes or lounges where adult use of cannabis can take place on premises, whether that's by vaping, whether that's by smoking, whether that's by other chemical means like gummies. So you have that authority as well in the event that you choose to go in that direction. If in fact you choose to allow or authorize retail sales in the village, the act itself, although it only has one proximity limitation, the 1,500 square foot between dispensaries, it has layers and layers of other regulations that address the aesthetics and advertising related to a cannabis dispensary. So I have set those forth here. So you're aware of these restrictions that already exist on certain operations of the dispensaries. As you can see, as you go down the list, no advertising can be placed or maintained on the premises of a dispensary within 1,000 feet of school grounds, playgrounds, hospitals, healthcare facilities, et cetera. And in the right-hand column, no advertising that promotes overconsumption of cannabis, no advertising that displays cannabis, no advertising that shows somebody under 21 consuming this chemical or cannabis, can't include the image of a cannabis leaf or bud, can't include any image that's likely to appeal to minors, et cetera. So this list is set forth in the Act itself. Any operation, any dispensary operation cannot engage in any of this advertising as part of its business. The actual operation of a dispensary, if you choose to authorize retail sales, by state law is only allowed between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Now, keep in mind the operation of a dispensary is also subject to your local regulations. So you could adopt regulations that are more strictly limited than these. For example, if you were to make a dispensary a special use, as part of the terms of a special use or the conditions of a special use, you could add additional limitations on the operation of a dispensary. So there can be, this may seem like common sense, you can't have a delivery service as part of your.
I was just chuckling over here.
I gotta
Stop by and pick up a pizza
Is it
too.
like Jimmy John's?
I chuckled when I saw that too, but they felt the need to put that in there.
Grubhub.
Yeah, Grubhub, yeah.
No drive-through facilities. This is not McDonald's. Operation is prohibited. So internally, when a dispensary is in operation, there are a number of internal controls regarding video equipment inside the facility, regarding the number of people that have to be working. There have to be at least two, a minimum of two working at one time. No alcohol can be sold. The state electronic verification system has to be in operation at all times. If it ever happens that there's a malfunction in that system, sales have to cease for that period of time until the system is up and running again. A significant protection going forward, whether sales are allowed or not, is that these products must be packaged and labeled going forward so that we know exactly what's being sold. That labeling has to include the contents, the weight of the raw cannabis or cannabis products, and the amount of the THC. There are limits, even though adults over 21 years old are allowed to possess and use cannabis. There are limits to the amount of cannabis that can be possessed at any one time and the concentration of the chemicals in the THC. The age of the purchaser has to be verified by checking a government-issued ID, and specific required sales information has to be entered into the state system for each sale that takes place. Significant controls regarding the retail operation. Prohibited activities under the Act. You cannot smoke cannabis in any public place where a person could reasonably be expected to be observed by others, or in a healthcare facility or any other place where smoking is prohibited. There is some, I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, there's some confusion under the Act about a provision that allows a municipality to designate places as non-public. So the question arises, if the Smoke-Free Illinois Act prohibits smoking in all kinds of areas, which it does, public places, can we, the municipality, the village of Cary, override that act, the Smoke-Free Illinois Act, by designating some place as a non-public place where cannabis can be consumed? That has to be, the act has to be revisited to clarify that provision in the act. No use of a motor vehicle while using or under the influence of cannabis, and no vending machine sales. Again, some of these things seem obvious, but they put them in the act to be certain. Taxation and revenue is an issue that at least municipalities, municipal officials, I think have a certain amount of interest in if retail sales are going to be allowed. There is a state tax, a pretty significant state tax levied on these products, on the sales. You see those taxes on the left-hand side here, state tax imposed at the following rates. 10% tax, 20% tax as the concentration of the chemical increases, up to a 25% tax. 8% of the taxes that are collected by the state on cannabis sales and cultivation will be returned to all municipalities, whether you allow sales or not. Whether retail sales are ever allowed in the Village of Cary, you receive an 8% distribution through the local government distribution fund for the specific purposes listed here: crime prevention programs, law enforcement training, and drug interdiction efforts. Local tax. There is a local sales tax that is allowed if you allow retail sales in the Village of Cary, up to a 3% tax on the purchase price. The State Department of Revenue collects this tax and would be distributing the tax after the overall collection of the state, based on authorized users in the state.
That's in addition to
The regular.
other,
8%.
the regular sales tax.
Correct. That's on top of the existing sales taxes, which will remain in force. This is for the police chief. Driving under the influence of cannabis continues to be illegal. The act itself allows for the use of validated roadside chemical tests to the extent they exist, not sure they do exist yet, or standardized field sobriety tests approved by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So we are hopeful, I think, with this being authorized as a lawful use in Illinois, that these particular tools are refined to some extent, so law enforcement has the ability to use more objective measures in the field in the event that someone is suspected of driving under the influence of cannabis. Pat, I don't know if you want to comment on that. I don't know that we have very refined tools at this point to discern when somebody is under the influence.
We have DREs, drug recognition experts, and there's day-ride training, but more interesting is the thresholds for per se,
Right.
5 nanograms and 10 nanograms, and there's no roadside test that tests that except for a blood test.
Right.
Does the Village of Cary have a DRE?
Yes.
So when we started our discussion, I mentioned the existing legislation passed in 2013, effective January 1, 2014, regarding medical cannabis. Those regulations, that legislation remains in effect, and that legislation authorized medical cannabis dispensaries by law. Municipalities had the ability to enact reasonable zoning regulations but could not prohibit those dispensaries. I have a list of some area municipalities that currently have medical cannabis dispensaries located within their boundaries, as well as some curbside photos, not all of which are as clear as they could be, that show you what some of these dispensaries look like from the streetscape. If you want to get some sense, just some practical sense of how these operate and what they look like in certain towns. Though the Medical Cannabis Act already authorized 56 dispensaries and 20 cultivation centers, I don't believe all those licenses have been issued at this point for medical cannabis dispensaries. And limited cultivation is allowed in private residences under that act. That is not a feature of the Recreational Cannabis Act. There is no, other than craft growers, which require a license, you cannot grow and use marijuana in your own residence. So those are the basics. As I mentioned, there are proximity limitations that were built into the Medical Cannabis Act because municipalities had only their zoning authority to regulate, not to prohibit. Under the Recreational Cannabis Act, you have the ability to prohibit altogether. So if you choose to allow it, you have the maximum amount of flexibility as to how you regulate medical or recreational cannabis dispensaries. These are, it's just a sampling of existing area medical dispensaries that currently have dispensaries that sell medical marijuana in the area. 13 are located within industrial parks in their particular municipality. 10 are located in what would be considered high traffic major retail corridors. and 7 are located adjacent to residential neighborhoods. So you see here Buffalo Grove, Mount Prospect, Addison, St. Charles, a sampling of those communities. I'll pass out, as I mentioned, the streetscape photos of these dispensaries that are already in operation. Last slide references the other. I couldn't get Vermont in here. I couldn't get my table to expand to include Vermont. Vermont hasn't issued any licenses yet and is the smallest state to be including recreational marijuana sales. Here's the list of the other 10 and the number of licenses that they have authorized to be issued in their state. If I can answer any questions, I'd be happy to try.
Where do you start?
So, and tonight really is for that purpose, Mayor, to get started thinking about what the Act provides and what information you may need, what additional information you may need to make decisions.
So I know this has nothing to do with the village, but drug testing, for employers, so as of January 1st, it's legal. So, I mean, I understand people who, fly or doctors or something like that would be subject to drug testing and things like
Yes,
that.
so-
But what about other people?
Right. The Act specifically provides that nothing changes relative to the use of whether it's alcohol or drugs in the workplace, and existing regulations, existing testing is not in any way affected or undermined by this law.
Okay.
Specifically for the Village of Cary, I do anticipate bringing at some point an update to our employee handbook here to the village board. So I'll be working with legal counsel to have that information updated to make sure that it is current. So
That's a good question. The Act did address that specifically, or does address that.
And then, I'm not too familiar with you can get pulled over and, they can go ahead and give you a DUI, but how would they, and I don't know the terminology that you guys were talking about earlier, but how would anybody know if they've had too much marijuana, like you've had too much alcohol? You know what I mean?
Right, so,
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, do you know?
There's not a
Yeah,
sobriety
right, so
test.
this is
Yeah, this
a
kind of-
nettlesome issue under this
Yes.
Act.
It is this challenge.
Say that again?
And that would be the issue that law enforcement has with this law, is that there's no mechanism to test samples without taking a blood test. For alcohol goes into your system and out of your system the same way. So we can test that. You're testing metabolites for cannabis. So what we had to do, and I don't know if the state still has the ability to, but they could do presumptive tests, meaning that they can say that it's present, but then they didn't have a quantitative test, so they had to send it someplace else. Currently, we send our samples to the University of Illinois at Chicago and their lab to test for the quantitative levels of cannabis. I will tell you that I have investigated traffic crashes that involved fatalities that involved inhalation, huffing, and some prescription medication for pain and cannabis use. And at that time, the cannabis use, when I was talking to someone from the crime lab, they were talking about like 2.5 nanograms would be an impairment level. We're talking here about 5 nanograms, which is double that level when I was doing that in 2011, 2012. So it's difficult to prosecute. Now, you can certainly do certain tests that drug recognition experts can administer. They're very well suited in terms of the physiological effects of certain drugs. So they will come in and they will do take blood pressure and temperature and ask people to do certain tests to determine or try to determine the level of intoxication or impairment.
Let's say somebody goes into a shop and, they've never done anything before and they want to go ahead and, drive somewhere. Is there something that's going to tell people like, don't do more than this? Or I know these are like maybe silly questions, but how are
Good
people
questions.
supposed to know, what's a safe amount to go ahead and then still be able to drive or be able to use a motor vehicle? Or
And I would
You know.
address that in terms of, this is only being allowed by adults. So
Yeah, age
adults
21
should
or
take
over.
that responsibility to make sure that if they don't have that experience with this substance, to not drive until they determine the level of impairment that they will, experience given whatever they're using in terms of concentration and in terms of substances. And what we have to do is determine if there's probable cause to believe that they're impaired. And if there is, then we will arrest them.
I got a question.
Go ahead.
How are other states doing it right now?
In regards
With
to,
law enforcement, like California, there's no test at all.
there's blood tests. That's the
That's
way you
the
have.
only for
Yeah,
everybody.
to my knowledge, that's the only manner or mechanism that you can use to scientifically determine
And
the
it
level
works
of.
the same way as alcohol. You have to consent to have the test done to you. Otherwise, you're.
Depends on what county you're in. If you're in McHenry County, you don't have to consent because we'll get a warrant.
Right.
So
it's different
what
everywhere.
we'll do is we'll ask you if you want to take a test. If you say no, if there's probable cause, we'll go before a judge. And if the judge believes there's probable cause, then we'll get a search warrant and we'll take your blood. And if you don't want us to take your blood, then we're going to charge you with obstructing justice.
Same as alcohol.
Exactly.
So this will fall the same way in
Yep.
Illinois.
Yeah, to some degree, it's analogous to alcohol, right? You can't use it when you're driving.
Right.
You can't have it open in your car when you're driving. That's part of the statute as well.
You can
It has to be
transport it,
sealed.
but it has to be in a sealed container.
Right, so if you go to a restaurant and you take a partially consumed bottle of wine, they can give it to you, but they have to seal it for you. Same thing here. You can't drive with it with an open container.
Right.
You can't use it when you're driving. You can't use it under 21. Trying to think of the other can'ts. You certainly can't use it if you're impaired or you're driving while you're impaired. So all those things are issues that we'll have to address as we go along. I know that there have been some experiences in other states in regards to incidents or increases in traffic crashes or other unintended consequences.
So there is also a threshold amount set by the act for the blood test results.
It's 5 nanograms.
Right, as there is with blood alcohol.
Right, that's
If you
0.08.
exceed a certain level with blood test results, you're presumed to be under the influence.
Correct. Which doesn't mean that we can't prosecute you if it's under that. It just means that it's not presumed that you are, so then I'd have a higher burden to try to prove that you're impaired.
So this is the equivalent of law enforcement pulling somebody over to determine whether or not they were under the influence before we had breathalyzers. Because we don't have that tool yet although we have blood tests, but we don't have the tool yet. That is quite as easy to use as a breathalyzer.
And I'm certain that there are companies such as Intoximeter that are looking at trying to produce such a device or scientific, a scientific manner device to use saliva, hair, or breath to determine the level of cannabis in someone, or actually it's THC, the active part of the use of cannabis in someone's system, in their bloodstream. The 5 nanograms was determined because I think that was what Colorado chose. Colorado chose 5 nanograms, and that's how it kind of was determined. So those are issues that I don't know how scientific that was done, but that's off the point in regards to this, and I could talk about this all day.
Is the 5 nanograms equivalent to the 0.08?
That's exactly it. It's analogous, exactly.
Is it same, so it's okay.
If you're 5 nanograms, it's presumed that you're impaired.
And what's a nanogram? How much in weight?
It's a small amount. I don't know exactly. I couldn't tell you. It's a nanogram. I'd have to turn to my scientific friend. Yeah, exactly. It's a very, very small amount.
When you reference the automobile accidents that you've sent blood samples down to U of I. When those come back, is it solely for marijuana, or are there multiple drugs found in
They
the
can do,
system?
yeah, they can do both. We can do a panel, yes. And we can do alcohol too when we do that. And they're not necessarily accidents. It's any, DUI prosecution, driving under the influence prosecution. So we'll take a blood test and we can send it to the University of Illinois at Chicago, and they can do a panel in addition to alcohol. So, but the issue is this. Because we don't want to waste resources, or these labs don't want to waste the resources, if they get a .08 on alcohol, they won't necessarily continue on with the analysis because they already have enough to prove up DUI. Now, if there's no alcohol and you're looking for drugs, they'll have to look at that.
Well, I think what we're looking to do is find out if there's an appetite to allow something like this in our village. If so, the various ways that we can control it from a municipal point of view. Some of the things that I had thought, Jake and I go back and forth on this all the time. But how do we zone this? Where do you want, if we were to allow it, where, I mean, these are all ifs. We should decide the direction that we want to go, but, zoning, I mean, he brought up a very good point about where we can zone it. We could, without calling it spot zoning, we can zone it to one particular area in town. We can determine the number that we would allow in town, the particular area through the zoning you could do. And, there are other things that the controls that we have in place, but if we don't have an appetite, or a majority of the board does not want to see this move forward, there's really there's no reason to continue conversation. So that's something that we need to take some time and think about. Just as a matter of fact, I mean, I go back and forth on this all the time. And when you look at things that have happened in our communities, nationwide, statewide, I mean, these things it's going to be legal. It's just like going to a bar and ordering a beer. It's going to be like going to buy a case of beer, or, like buying tobacco and that stuff. But, you look at some of these social media things where a permitted use, for example, right now opened up last week, a vape store. Oh my gosh, you would have thought we allowed something that was just really a horrible business, but that's a permitted use. I mean, that's a business that is accepted. It's a form of tobacco, and it's, do we want to have a piece of this? Is this something that we want to have? So, I'm not asking for a decision today, but I think that we need to have serious conversations about that, and I'd love to hear what people say, and if you have specific questions, this is the time that we could do it, because January 1st is around the corner. And I know that I would rather be on the proactive side than reactive and decide what exactly that we want to do, because I think that that's important. That'll show that we're strong in what we want to do. So I'd love to hear what people's individual thoughts are. Jennifer brought up some really great questions. I'd love to hear what Trustee Cavelli has to say from another policing perspective. I've heard the chiefs a lot, and we talk about this all the time.
Similar.
Yeah, but maybe you could set some different light, Chris and Dale too, what your thoughts are on this, and so we can kind of.
I'll just say, realized the Illinois Chiefs of Police Association did strongly advocate against it, and there was several stipulations on why they did so. I am not in favor of having a dispensary in Cary.
I am not in favor of having a dispensary.
Not opposed.
They're not opposed.
I
Just
need
want
more information, yeah, a lot more information, but.
I want to read over what was sent to us today.
I want to read over it too.
I'll be solo in favor of it.
Is there other information here that the board would find helpful that you'd like staff to gather?
I'd like to see it on a map, how restrictive we already are and how restrictive it is and where it could actually go in this town right now.
We do actually, yeah, that we do have that. We do have something on the books. We have an ordinance
Yeah, I
about.
just haven't seen it, so yeah, I'd love to see that and see where, I mean, it seems, the law from the state seems really restrictive already.
We have a lot of control going forward,
Right, we can
obviously, if
control.
we do want to pursue this, of where it would go. But absolutely, we can gather that information.
Yep, but keep the conversation going, find out, talk to each other about what you want, utilize staff, talk to the chief. The chief is very knowledgeable when it comes, it's like, I go back and forth, to be quite honest. Sometimes I think it might, if it's allowed, just like having a bar or, a tobacco store or something of that nature, where do we draw the line? Is that what we want to, if everybody else is going to have them in the community, why should we isolate the village of Cary? If it's, Mr. Moneybags over here is always looking at the revenue source, and this could quite be a decent source of revenue.
What towns have outlawed or said no already to it or put it on their books? Do we know?
Yeah, you have a.
Or how many have, or?
There aren't many that have acted yet. Since we don't have to take action until January 1, I think a lot of towns are doing what you're doing. They're engaging in sort of preliminary look at what the information is from around the country, what the information is available here in the state of Illinois to make a decision. So
I think it's trending about 50-50.
Yeah.
Communities that are going to allow it and not allow it.
Well, I think Arlington Heights is allowing it. Mount Prospect is allowing it.
Wakanda.
We can, maybe to help, I guess, narrow down the information, because instead of reviewing all the articles, we could probably put together a list of who's already acted
I
on it.
was looking for a number.
Either
They're
way.
allowing 75 licenses. I was just wondering how many are
Yeah.
in favor of it already.
So something to keep in mind, again, this doesn't contain all the information about the legislation or that you may need to make decisions. The initial wave, there are 3 waves of licenses that are going to be authorized. The first is this January 1, 2020, 75 licenses become available. In 2021, I think that increases to 200 some licenses. And in 2022 or 2022, it goes up to 500 some. So eventually, if we look at 75 and say, well, that could be spread out quite a bit across the state. If we get to 500,
Are they
they're going to be in most places.
Are they allowing the places that already have medical license
They have first preference.
to add this license?
Correct.
This is a separate license for medical on top.
Correct.
What controls do we have for, like we do with gaming? We're going to look at our gaming licensing. What type of licensing fees are we going to be able to do? Are we, since we're non-home rule, are we capped at that, or is that
No.
something that we could?
Right, we cannot get involved in licensing. That's an exclusive state function. You can, if you have a business license where you have the ability to inspect the premises to make
CO.
sure they're in compliance, you can continue to enforce those kinds of regulations, but we can't get into any aspect of licensing.
No?
That's a
It's
state.
not like, it's not like a liquor license where
It's
we
not
can
like a
charge for
liquor
that.
license, yeah.
Right.
Huh.
Yeah.
I didn't know
That's
that.
kind of frustrating.
Another question,
my-
the additional 3% tax on it, even though we're not home rule, we're still allowed to enact that if we choose to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Mayor, how do you feel about it?
The marijuana, I was absolutely against it for the longest time until I hear about some of these other communities that are doing it, and the more I learn about it, I'm open to it. I'm open to having conversations. I'd like to engage all you guys into what your thoughts are, where you would think it would be. I would, if I were to make a decision on that, I would allow one in the village. I wouldn't allow multiple. I'd zone it to a particular area that would be kind of off the beaten path, that it's not in everybody's face, not that they can have a lot of signage, but I would not like to see it in our downtown district or any of the closer ones. A lot of these other municipalities are putting them in off sites. So, some put them in the main drags. The more information you get, the more frustrating it gets, because, we have an opportunity here to, we're always looking for money that maybe that's a revenue source that we put for capital projects. I don't know. We have no idea what the amount would be. And my fear is at any given time, and I've maintained this all along, is that this is against the law federally. At any given time, the federal government can come and shut this all down. It's a cash business. There's no banking institutions allowed in this. So those are a lot of red flags. Is that going to open us up to something else? So there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, in my opinion. Jake and I talk about this all the time. We have very spirited conversations about this. And
Can I get clarification on something? The 3% that you talked about, so what does that include additional training, like for police? Or is that 3% across the board for everything?
That's
Like,
an
is there
additional.
additional
That's
built in for that?
8%.
we get 8% on top, and then we get, not only will we get the retail sales tax portion of that, there's an additional 3% that we'll get, plus through the state will be refunded through our LGF program at 8% of the sales.
But that's even if we don't have it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
correct. The 3%, and you factor in the sales tax in it, that could be significant. I mean, we talk here all the time about trying to find new revenue sources.
Well, and the only reason why I bring that up is, yes, I think it would bring in additional revenue sources, but what other costs would we incur as a result of it? You know, for instance, if we do have to do additional training, that DRE training, it's extremely expensive, very difficult training, it's expensive, so. I
Is
mean,
that
there's
a training that each officer receives or a department?
No.
Chief.
No, they don't, but
Chief.
they could. I mean, it's on a
They-
cost per
It
officer.
could, but
to be-
it is one of the most.
Well, A-RIDE
intense
is
trainings.
the kind of the watered-down version of a DRE, and it's specific to roadside testing for substances, because our DUI laws and our standard field sobriety testing is only specific to alcohol. And then that's why they say standardized roadside validated testing, because they haven't addressed this yet. So, but now there are DREs, and we have one, Sergeant Witherow is a DRE, and he went through the training, very extensive training. It's very difficult, very, very difficult. And then every year he goes to a conference to maintain that certification. So, that's another ongoing training cost. But it doesn't matter if you have it in town or outside of town,
Yeah.
because people are going to be driving through town.
Right.
It's-
That's
So-
exactly
here.
what Scott just said. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, are
It's
you
gonna be in the
also,
state.
if you're stopping vehicles, are you calling in the special DRE to handle these cases? Are we incurring additional overtime?
Of course.
I'm
Yeah.
just saying, are these additional expenses, even though we're getting this revenue, we also need to take into consideration just some other expenses we may incur? 'Cause I think, if my understanding, that some of the issues Colorado's had is they've been promised all these revenues, but there's other additional expenses that have come along the way that they didn't anticipate.
Those are the unintended consequences, in terms of, impact to firefighting and impact to social services and things of that nature.
That's going to be an impact regardless if we own a
Right.
dispensary or not,
Well,
because it's illegal in the state.
Right.
Some friends that I know that travel back and forth to some of these states that allow it, especially Colorado, they said that there's a significant difference there. I mean, there's a
Significant. I've
smell
been there
of
recently.
marijuana in the air all the time. Well, really.
But
But, you
our
know, it's-
law
No, there's just a
wouldn't allow
decrease.
public use.
Well, does
right?
theirs allow public use? Can you be on the side?
That I
thought
couldn't
it-
tell you, but I would imagine it does if you can smell it.
I just
I
don't.
think it does.
Yeah.
So, I mean, from from my very limited amount of knowledge I have about the Colorado law versus what I've read in here, it's a lot more restrictive in regards to where you can use it and things of that nature. So, I mean, they did take into account where it could be used and how it can be used.
So I'm probably, this is a ridiculous question, but I'll answer anyway. So if we don't allow this and somebody buys it somewhere else, they can still consume it at home?
Absolutely.
It's just-
Use is legal.
The use is legal?
Yep.
Right, okay.
That's kind of where I'm leaning to, is that if we say no, has the county had any kind of conversations on it?
I haven't heard
You know,
anything yet.
if the
We're
county,
going to, through McCog, we're working on putting together a mayors and administrators synopsis of all these things with all McHenry County to kind of get an understanding of what people are doing and more education.
Fox River Grove is leaning towards
Towards it,
approving
yeah.
it, yeah. I haven't seen some of the other agencies here in McHenry County.
There's a
but-
lot of the other mayors, they're on the fence post, probably for a lot of the same reasons I am.
it's not like when January 1st comes, all these people are going to suddenly decide, oh, I'm going to run out and start smoking pot. It's already happening.
Right.
The world's not going to
I'm
end.
leaning towards, I'm in favor of looking for a location.
The world is not going to
Village
end. We'll just have
Well, that's solo
to
one.
meet the challenge.
And I would just, our next agenda item here, we have our CIP breakdown too. And just so the board understands here, I mean, where I was trying to find dollars, we look at the total cost for over 5 years, is we got $30 million worth of projects and our projected funding is 19 million. And, this revenue here for cannabis could be pretty significant to help us fund capital projects, to help us fund vehicle and equipment, land conservancy, building fund, general operations here at the village. So it's not inconsequential, the revenue.
It's coming. We just have to decide what we
Yeah.
want.
What was it that you sent out today, Jake?
Oh, Kleinthorpe Jenkins.
That was a
Oh, is that the first thing that
FAQ.
we saw?
It was an FAQ from Kleinthorpe and Jenkins.
Okay.
So
I just copied it.
It's about 30 pages.
Okay.
More in depth.
I
Right,
just
so-
haven't looked at
I
that
just-
So
yet.
we thought you didn't want to be here till midnight? So we sent the Q&A.
We appreciate that. We appreciate that. Thanks.
But I would encourage everybody to talk to each other about this, one way or another, what we're going to have to make a decision.
Right, I mean, the reality is, like I said, whether we like it or we don't like it, it's here.
Yeah.
So now it's a matter of how do you address it the most effectively.
Or if there's more information, please let me
Let
know.
me just read this.
Yeah, if you find anything, Kim, if you have anything that you're finding, let us know, please.
So what is the next step with this?
Well, I think we're going to be gathering some more information. I would encourage everybody to talk to each other, talk to myself or Jake, see where you guys are leaning, what other information that you want to have to help you make a decision. Because, I'd like to put something on the agenda sometime to make a determination so staff has an understanding of what we want to do, because I'm sure you get calls now. So it's, we need to offer some direction in that.
I mean, all these pictures that are given are almost, I mean,
All industrial park.
yeah, well, a lot of them are, but, I mean, they're not, like, I don't know what people are thinking, but.
They're not in your face.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I like about, it's got to be nondescript. And, I mean, it's amazing, but, all right, and is there any other comments on this? Otherwise, we'll move ahead to the revolving loan fund. But please keep in touch with everybody, encourage conversations with everybody. Thank you. Revolving loan fund. Michael, show me the money.
We, speaking of money, yeah.
You want us to sell pot?
So our revolving loan fund, at their last meeting, Trustee Kraus had asked to discuss the revolving loan fund. I think most of the board members are aware of the revolving loan fund that we had in place here at the Village of Cary. We currently have 4 outstanding loans, 750 Cucina, Kojak's, Cary Ale House, and Spirit Water Brewery. As a part of the budget process here, and I've included some slides for you as just a reminder, we had a shortfall in our capital projects fund, and so we had closed the revolving loan fund to be able to handle that shortfall in the capital projects fund. So essentially, the fund was closed. Certainly, we're trying to find additional revenue sources, not only for if we wanted to restart this program in the future, but for our capital projects fund, vehicle and equipment, land conservancy here. So with that, I would answer any questions that the village board would like answered related to this, and encourage any discussion on this.
How much money do we have out currently in loans? 178. My thought was, I think this is a good tool to have in our toolbox in terms of economic development for businesses in the village. And I think the money that we have currently out, I'm not saying let's put back the 500,000 that we had in there and we took out. Let's use the money that we have currently out and create the fund as they repay
When it
it,
matures.
replenish that fund, and just use that as recycling. So we'd have like 175,000 in
Where is
there.
that
Right
money?
now, we wouldn't have anything, or maybe like a couple of thousand.
Well, that money is going to the capital projects fund to be able to cover infrastructure projects that we
The
have
money that's being
ongoing.
paid back.
Correct. Our capital projects fund, quite frankly, we're going to be close to zero at the end of this fiscal year, as we've talked about at previous budget meetings.
One of the things, again, in my spirited debates with Administrator Rife, what would you think about, instead of identifying specific funds for this fund, like throwing a dollar amount in this line item, that we keep it in our toolbox and it would be based on a specific project. If a specific project comes that we have a huge appetite for and that we think that would be great and there's opportunities for us, then we could determine at that time if there's some things, because he says Jake said that he would be willing to figure some things out to kind of switch some things around. I don't know how much that would be, But I would love to be able to offer to potential businesses or developers that they want to have, but there would obviously have to be some sort of a cap, trying to be responsible. But, you know, a lot of our surrounding communities are doing the same thing. They're offering this kind of money. We don't have that kind of money that they do, but it's something that people ask, right? Don't they? They ask for it. So, you know, depending upon what it is.
I would say we always have tools here. You know, we have an incentive agreement for sales tax sharing agreement or other tools in our toolbox. I do think this is, I don't disagree with that this is a tool. I do think it's time, though, to take care of our own house and our own finances related to our capital projects fund, vehicle and equipment fund. Maybe if we find a funding source for the capital projects fund, we could come back and you know, look at this program in the future. But I look at some of our residents out there, and I'm not crazy about, I guess, getting in the loan business and continuing to be in the loan business. There's risk associated with that. I think that we have plenty of projects here that we need to dedicate dollars to, and I think that should be our focus and not providing these dollars to outside agencies such as restaurants and other businesses.
Other thoughts?
I think that it shouldn't be a case-by-case basis. Is that what you're saying? I think it should be whatever we decide to do, if we do decide to do it, that it should be equal to whoever we decide to, so it's fair.
I don't think you can pick and choose. If we're going to allow it, we're going to allow it. I don't want somebody to say, well, we thought about yours and we really want your business, so we'll consider it for you. But you know what? I don't really like your business, so I'm not going to consider it.
Well, I don't think, maybe I didn't make myself good, but if something came, I mean, not that we would have to pick from 3 separate businesses. If somebody came and said they're considering opening up
Which is what we do
shop
now.
here in town,
What we have done.
and they were looking for that, that's what I mean, that at that particular time, that we would look at that. It's not like that we would go out advertising it, but, you know, at times we might need to ante up a little something. But I understand that we're constricted with dollars. We have this conversation all the time.
Yeah.
But I don't want to, I agree with Trustee Kraus that I think it's an important tool to be able to offer if we can make it work. But if we can't make it work, we can't make it work.
I think we're either in or we're out. I mean, I want to provide, you know, Director Simmons with clear direction here. So if someone calls, he's like, well, maybe not. Either he says yes or no. If the board wanted to, you know, tap into land conservancy dollars to restart the program, that's an option. If the board wanted to tap into general fund balance to restart the program, that is an option for you to consider. So I want to provide those options for the board so that you can make your own decision.
The loans that are currently out, how long do they have to pay them for again?
All the existing loans that we have out now come due in 2024. So the most recent loan we had was just a 5-year loan, but the other ones we've done have already had 2 years under their term. So the total balance is about $178,000, but they all become due at some point during that year.
How long was the loan term? Was it like 7 or 8 years?
7.
The first 3 were all 7-year loans, so the most recent one was only a 5-year term was asked for.
We offered them 7, but they only requested 5.
So I like the idea of maybe having a designated dollar amount, which would be like the 175. But if it's already being used up, then sorry, we don't offer the program. But as people pay it back and there's funds now in the fund, let's say there's $20,000 available because we had one loan paid off, then we have $20,000 available to loan. That's how I would like to see the program.
Yeah, Michael's jumping at, yeah.
Is that not possible?
No, it's already being diverted into.
Going to the capital
going to
projects
capital.
fund.
When we had our last budget discussion, the decision was made that the revolving loan fund would be closed into the capital projects fund. And with that went all of the existing loans as well as the loan repayments. So in essence, there really isn't a pot of money, and any money you'd be talking about would be new money that we would be taking to fund one of these projects. I mean, I am currently under the belief myself that any of the businesses that currently have those loans would have been here in Village of Cary, whether we provided them additional money or not. From my experience with economic incentive agreements, it's generally based on the fact of that you are competing against another location in an attempt to bring it into your community. And it is an exceptional use that would provide significant sales tax dollars or tax benefits to the village. To some degree, with some of these, you will reach a point where existing businesses who aren't receiving the benefits of the loan say, why should one business get it and the rest of us don't participate? So I think that's something we have to keep in mind as well. I think really right now, in terms of our own projects that we have out there, from my standpoint, I look at it as taxpayer money. So in essence, you're taking taxpayer money and giving it to a private business in the form of a loan. But we have a whole list of projects sitting out there that I can tell you next budget year will need to be funded. And that's my concern.
Makes sense.
Well, and I'm just going to throw random numbers out there. Let's say it's $175,000 that you have there, but then through the interest, you're recouping, let's say, $25,000. Yeah, I'm just throwing numbers out there to make it even. Okay, so it's $200,000 now. So that $25,000 then goes into your general fund or your capital projects or whatever else. But that $175,000 would always stay specifically for that incentive program to offer to businesses. But you still, you're essentially investing in taxpayer money.
Technically, I'm already using the 175 to fund our capital projects program now. So in essence, we're starting from zero, because all of the present dollars that we have, in my mind, they're already accounted for.
Right here.
I'm not saying that we can't take money and put it out there for someone. You know, another point I'd make too. All of these businesses that have received these loans are solid businesses, businesses that we appreciate having in the Village of Cary. But in the event somebody would have a struggle within their own business, in terms of where we'd fall on the creditor list in terms of being repaid our money. So in one sense, it's a very good thing. It seems like a good thing to do. But on the other hand, if there is one bad experience, I'm not sure we want to deal with that experience either. And it's just something to keep in mind, because technically it is public money that we're giving these businesses. And I honestly believe they'd be here whether we gave them the money or not.
The other thing, are you leaning towards, you know, we have banks in our town that people could go and apply for an SBA loan. Granted, it would be a little bit higher interest rate, but rates are still darn low, so it's not, is that what I mean, I'm just talking from a perspective of saying, hey, if you're going to come here, here's where you should get your loan, is through an SBA loan.
When you look at when most of these programs started, it was when interest rates were sitting out there at 15%.
Correct.
And so for a business owner to go to a bank and get a loan, he couldn't even obtain it at 15%. Currently, we're looking at interest rates that are long-term interest rates that are 3% at best. So it's not the cost of money that's keeping them. If a business is operating on that slim a margin that they need a $25,000 or a $50,000 loan to keep them going, that's a whole nother issue to be considered.
Jeff, do you have any comments or other
No,
questions?
I think it's a good program.
Yeah, I do too.
What other tools we have for businesses like that then, besides a new business, brick and mortar coming in and laying down a new building and lowering impact fees? We're more talking about businesses that are coming into existing buildings. How do you
I mean, if it was a business that was a large sales tax generator,
Sales tax.
we could always have a sales tax incentive agreement that's sitting out there.
There's options out there for us. I just think come the spring, we're going to have challenging budget discussions again, especially related to the capital projects fund. We've got infrastructure work in there, flooding related work, road, sidewalk, road patching. I think we need to figure out our own house here before we start passing out money, and especially public dollars.
I'd still like to come back to this at some point.
Yeah.
Talking about a dispensary in town and adding 3% sales tax, that there's chances that fund that again at some point.
The program's on our radar here. We close the fund for now, but things change. That doesn't mean we can't restart the program in the future, but I just, knowing the board's priorities and knowing, what our staff wants to get done here, I just don't think it's prudent right now from a financial perspective.
I understand, I agree with that. I mean, I will reiterate that I too do like the program. I liked having that option for a business. Whether they would come or not come is neither here nor there. But I did like it, but I also can understand the financial aspects of it that says, just because we want it, there's, sometimes you got to champagne taste on a beer budget. Sometimes you got to say, here's what we're dealing with. But I would like to keep that open to revisit it as the opportunity arises.
Especially if we find out funding for it.
Correct, if we can find a
Well,
revenue
and
source
also
for
too
it.
with this, the January 1st, aren't gaming, aren't they allowed 6 machines? It says 5.
So maybe we should visit that. To allow 6.
Well, good discussion. Reality. Okay, I will entertain a motion to adjourn into executive session to discuss personnel collective bargaining, Illinois 120/2C2.
Before we do that, is there future agenda items?
Not, this is committee.
Oh, sorry.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? There are no nays. Adjourning at 7:49.
I think I did that last week.
Thanks, Brian.